entitled The Girl I Left Behind Me by Leroy Anderson, which will be conducted this evening by John Owen Davis. The Irish Suite was a 6-movement suite commissioned by the Erie Society of Boston for a Pops concert conducted by Arthur Fugler on June 6, 1947. Originally entitled Erie Suite, Anderson wrote it in 12 days. This setting of the traditional The Girl I Left Behind Me is the 6th movement of the Irish Suite, and the score is dedicated to the conductor, Mr. Fiedler. This work is an air in March time, long associated with the British Army, and formerly played when the regiment was changing its quarters from one town to another. There is also an Irish claim to the tune, using the title The Girl I Left Behind Me, that also dates to the late 1790s, but no proof can be made either way of where it was first used. Enjoy. Eric Whitacre, conducted by David Triplett-Rosa. Grammy-winning composer and conductor, Eric Whitacre is one of the most performed musicians of our time. Born in 1970, he studied composition at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and the prestigious Juilliard School. His works, both choral and instrumental, have rapidly become accepted due to their strong appeal to audiences and players alike. In addition to composing, Whitacre tours the globe as a conductor of his own works. Sleep began its life in winter of 1999. Julie Armstrong, a lawyer and professional mezzo-soprano, wanted to commission a choral work from Whitacre in memory of her parents' passing. She asked, but he set her favorite poem, Robert Frost's immortal Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. Inspired by her spirit and moved by her request, Whitacre crafted the piece to perfection and premiered it in October 2000. Shortly after, Whitacre found himself in a long legal battle to use the poem in performance. He was ultimately denied that right. Rather than give up publishing the work, Whitacre asked poet Charles Anthony Silvestri to write a new text, which would correspond to the meter and expressive details emphasized in the music. Silvestri offered the poem Sleep, inspired by the last stanza of Frost's work. introduce our board president, Daniel Stevens, who will introduce the guest speaker that we have joining us tonight. Mr. Stevens.
Thank you all for coming tonight. I'd like to introduce a special guest tonight, Mr. Jay Chetney.
Good evening. Thank you so much for inviting me here this evening, Daniel, and this wonderful Tampa Bay Pride Band. I'm here to share the story of what happened to me during the Stonewall riots in June of 1969. That year, 50 years ago, I had made a decision to step away from my day-to-day life and devote myself to ending the war in Vietnam. To that end, I was living and working in a communal farmhouse in rural Connecticut, which was the headquarters for the New England Committee for Nonviolent Action. It was our mission to train anti-war activists in the techniques and philosophy of nonviolent action, as practiced by Gandhi and Martin Luther King. The week before Stonewall, I had hitched a ride into New York to attend the public viewing and wake for my beloved idol, Judy Garland. That meant sleeping out on the sidewalks of Madison Avenue so that I'd be in line to pay my respects. It was an emotional time for me and all other friends of Dorothy, so I was even more freaked out the very next morning when I was shaken awake at the place where I was crashing to take an urgent call from the farm in Connecticut. That's when I got the news that the Greenwich Village faggots had gone crazy, and they were rioting after resisting a police raid on a bar called the Stonewall Inn. My group and other pacifist groups were being alerted by the Quaker Meeting House in the village, calling for help to come to cope with all the weirdos who were up in arms and causing mad chaos. It was incredible news, and I got down to Christopher Street, which is where the bar was located, as soon as possible. On arrival, as I walked through the village, I was immediately stunned by the evidence of all the overwhelming rage and anger that had been unleashed during the night. Cobblestones had actually been uprooted from the streets. Bricks and rocks were scattered everywhere, and it was all covered with the glass shards from broken beer bottles. The Stonewall Inn itself was trashed and looked like it had been bombed. There had been multiple attempts through the night to evacuate the cops that had led the raid, but they were finally evacuated. The streets still were swarming with a lot of angry men and women trying to relive the exploits of that night. The Stonewall Inn was never a bar where I had felt comfortable, but it didn't surprise me that it was their tough and defiant patrons who were the first to resist a police raid. Stonewall was known as a refuge for some very hardcore hustlers, outrageous drag queens like Mary, Queen of the Scotch, and and what we used to call cross-dressers. It was a haven for men and women who were shunned at other homosexual bars. Around noon that day, a small group of us found our way over to the meeting house, where we quickly realized that this was not a situation where our usual practices of nonviolent action were going to work, but still we wanted to find a way to demonstrate our defiance. Eventually I came up with a plan to start working with the Stonewall staff to help them open and get their bar reopened. This was in direct violation and opposition to the police orders, which we wanted to order to keep the bar closed. The rest of the day was spent cleaning up the debris, setting up folding chairs and tables, and unloading the back of some trucks with a new jukebox, kegs of beer, and in those days, we always had to have a cigarette machine. That second evening, as we were drinking our reward in the back of the bar and were in good spirits, we felt well prepared for our upcoming arrest, because there was no doubt in anyone's mind that the police would be back to try and close the bar. It was our plan to refuse to vacate, and during the arrest, we were going to assume a posture called the slump. That way, the police couldn't just cuff us and walk us out. It would literally take 3 or 4 of them to lift us up and carry each one of us out to a paddy wagon. It was a very risky ploy, but had never failed to frustrate the hell out of the cops. As the evening progressed, hundreds of New Yorkers from all over the city start refilling the streets of Greenwich Village, and the tensions kept rising. This time, the city decided to send in a full 100-man squad from the tactical police force. They were dressed in full riot gear, wearing helmets and shields, and carrying their billy clubs. They formed a phalanx to push through the streets, and as they marched towards the Stonewall, the crowds began heckling and jeering flirtatiously, calling out their looks and blowing kisses. As the police progressed, the crowd fell back into the labyrinth of side streets and alleys that make up the village, and then they came swarming back through other alleys. They ended up totally surrounding the cops and freaking them out. Inside the bar, I was being arrested for refusing to vacate. 3 cops were about to carry me through the doorway and dump me into a paddy wagon when suddenly one of the tactical police charged directly at me, screaming at the top of his lungs, "You're nothing but a hippie faggot," while repeatedly swinging his billy club against my knee. The violence of the assault caught everyone by surprise. Even the cops who were holding me lost their grip and backed away. That's when the faggots of Christopher Street swooped in, rescued me, and carted me off. The only clearly thing I remember after that evening was smoking a couple of joints and listening to an album, my first time to hear Pink Floyd. Initially, at the time of the riots, there was almost no press coverage. It was just another example of what little regard there was in our country for issues facing the homosexual community. One can only imagine the public outrage and news coverage if police had been assaulted in any other neighborhood. But thanks to the Village Voice and some very nasty tabloid coverage, and then the fact that the story was really too good, it was picked up by the Associated Press and quickly spread across the country like wildfire. Almost immediately, the events at Stonewall became that final galvanizing moment for gay men and women all over the country to start meeting openly and in public to discuss our need for equality. No longer were these issues just being discussed in a few small rooms in New York or LA, but in communities of all sizes throughout the United States. Within days, the Christopher Street Liberation Front was formed, and meetings started up in a place called the Old Town Hall. In the spirit of the revolution, we tried to function by using consensus and avoiding any traditional organized structure. The meetings were really wild and very crazy affairs because of that. So before long, the women realized they had to split off, and they resurrected a group called the Daughters of Bilitis. There was also a resurgence of a more conservative group called the Mattachine Society, and later developed a more structured group called the Gay Activists Alliance. Plus there were lots of other small targeted groups like STAR, which was Street Transvestites of America Rising. One unifying cause among all the dozens of these new groups was that we needed to maintain the momentum that had been created by the riot. It was decided that we were going to mark the first anniversary of Stonewall with a massive protest march in New York and hopefully LA. By June of 1970, mimeograph machines, which is all we had, were in overdrive all over the country, and homosexual communities were heavily leafleted to announce the Christopher Street Gay Liberation Day Parade on the 27th of June, 1970. This was the very first Pride. I carpooled back into New York that June with friends from my gay consciousness raising group. And as we headed towards Sheridan Square, I was reunited with my hero, Frank Kameny, who's called the grandfather of gay liberation. There were hundreds of people gathering, but the march kept on getting stalled as we realized there was another group gathering in Washington Square. But eventually we all got together and started off. But instead of marching and walking, we almost started running. Not just because we were excited, but we were a little fearful about what was going to happen. We knew we had permits, but we didn't have a clue about how we were going to be received by the city, and more importantly, the cops. The plan was to march the 60 blocks up 6th Avenue from Sheridan Square and end in the sheep meadow of Central Park, and then we were going to have a gay-in. As we left the village, we happily discovered that both sides of 6th Avenue were lined with men and women from all over New York, clapping and cheering to show their support. It was startling to see how many brave New Yorkers had actually come out. And while the sidewalks weren't packed, once we started chanting, "Get off of the curbs and into the streets," our numbers began to grow. So by the time we got to Central Park, there were over 7,000 of us. To be honest, the police were actually pleasant that day, and some were even smiling as we passed through the intersections. So we relaxed and started enjoying ourselves, taking our pace to more of a joyful walk. But at one point, we approached a building under construction. It was covered in scaffolding, and dozens of brick masons were at work. We had no idea how they were going to react or what they were going to do with their bricks. But in the spirit of true New York construction workers who knew a good thing when they saw it, catcalls and whistles erupted, and they started shaking their butts. It was one of the most beautiful days in my life, and it was the largest gathering of free gay men and women in the history of the world. So now, I would like to have you join me in a rally cry that was written and created for this march. All good protest marches have to have their special chant. These words were written by Frank Kameny, but they were hotly debated. So this is what we came out with. So I'm going to lead off, and I hope the band and everyone will join me. So here we go. Say it clear. Say it clear. Say it loud. Say it loud. Gay is good. Gay is good. Gay is proud. Gay is proud. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay, for sharing your experiences with us. Our next piece is entitled "A Mother of a Revolution" by Omar and will be conducted by David Triplett-Rosa. And these are Mr. Thomas's words. This piece is a celebration of the bravery of trans women, and in particular, Marsha, pay it no mind, Johnson. Marsha is credited with being one of the instigators of the famous Stonewall uprising of June 28, 1969, one of the pivotal events of the LGBTQ liberation movement of the 20th century, which is commemorated annually during the worldwide Gay Parade celebrations. Existing as a trans woman, especially a trans woman of color, and daring to live authentically, creating space for oneself in a transphobic world, is one of the bravest acts I can imagine. Over 20 trans women were murdered in the United States in 2018 alone. There is no demographic more deserving, and frankly, long overdue for highlighted heroism and bravery. The disco vibe in the latter half of the piece is meant to honor club culture, a sacred space held amongst LGBTQ persons in which to love, live, mourn, heal, strategize, connect, disconnect, and dance in defiance of those outside forces who would seek to do LGBTQ persons harm simply for daring to exist and take up space. We pump our fists to honor the life, heroism, activism, and bravery of Marsha P. Johnson to honor the legacy of the Stonewall Revolution, to honor the memory of the trans lives violently ended due to fear and hatred, and in honor of trans women worldwide who continue to exist unapologetically and who demand to be seen. Mr. Owen Davis, to the Tampa Bay Symphonic Winds. Aren't we so very lucky to have them? Come and join us again.